Welcome. My name is Peter Stordy, and this lecture is about research ethics within the social sciences. Please note, the Information School is within the Faculty of Social Science. So, what is research ethics? To begin with, we should be clear about what research is. Within a research-intensive university, like the University of Sheffield, it is a process of investigation leading to new insights effectively shared. In other words, it's about creating new knowledge, not just searching for it. In the social sciences, the research conducted inevitably involves people, sometimes termed human participants, and/or their personal data. The University of Sheffield states we must have respect for the participants' dignity, rights, safety and well-being, including their personal data. All this can be summarised as research ethics. So essentially, research ethics is about respecting people and their personal data. This is all very nice, but what does it mean in practice? This is what this lecture is about. The core reading material for this lecture can be found in an ESRC publication called the Research Ethics Handbook. So, what are the underlying messages? The first is that ensuring research is ethical is not an afterthought. It's not something you do at the end of your research. Ethical considerations should be considered from the very beginning of your research. So for your research, it begins from the very moment you begin your initial proposal. You may have a wonderful research idea, but when you start thinking about the ethical considerations of your research, you may find out that it needs to be modified or indeed even abandoned. So it's important to think about ethics from the very, very beginning. Research ethics is a process. It's not an end product. It's something you need to continually think about during the research process. New ethical issues may arise as the research is conducted, which you need to address. Furthermore, participants need to have the option of withdrawing from your research at any point. This is particularly relevant if you're doing a longer piece of research, longitudinal research. And something which is not often spoken about is that thinking about ethics goes hand in hand with producing good research. The two are synonymous. When thinking about research ethics, you should think about sampling, consent, confidentiality, and your research methods. These might form 4 paragraphs, 4 sections in your final dissertation. First of all, sampling. You may hear the term research population, particularly in more quantitative research. This is all the individuals eligible to be in your research, and often your research question will dictate the research population. Now, you cannot research all the research population, so you have to sample. Sample means you have to select some of the research population. If you do so, participants should be aware about why they've been chosen and not other people. Just imagine the scenario. You've decided to research how people find information if they fail an examination. Imagine now that as participants are coming out of the exam hall, you say to them, "Can you take part in my research? I'm finding out what people do to find information related to failing their examination." If you didn't tell them that you were talking to all students leaving the hall, they might worry that they failed the examination. That wouldn't be ethical. Now, many sampling issues relate to consent, and we'll talk about that later. There are many ethical issues related to who and how you sample. Is your sample representative of the research population? If your research population has an equal number of males and females, then maybe your sample also needs an equal number of male and females. In qualitative research, this adds credibility to your research, although it's not always essential to have an equal number of males and females if your research population has an equal number of male and females. However, in quantitative research, this can be a major problem and prevent you generalizing your findings. If you don't consider this issue, you're not being ethical in your research. Is your sample inclusive? Does not unnecessarily exclude anyone. Here's a couple of examples. Inconvenient participants. Imagine that you are researching people's behaviour in the information commons. If you only sample during the day, you're excluding those that use the information commons at night, in the evening, and therefore saying your sample is representative of the research population may not be true, because people in the evening, at night time, may behave differently. Also, some participants are more challenging. They may not speak the same language as you as their first language, and so you mustn't exclude them from your sample just because it's more difficult for you to talk to them. And to use a quantitative term, you need to be careful about introducing bias into your sample by making your sample representative and making your sample inclusive. The cornerstone of research ethics is that participants should give their consent to being researched. There are some exceptions, but these are rare, and for your research you will probably not be permitted to conduct your research without getting informed consent. So informed consent means that participants should give their consent to being researched. It's a cornerstone of the Nuremberg Code post-World War II and the Helsinki Declaration 1964. Giving consent means being properly informed about the research you are about to be involved in, and you give it freely without coercion or persuasion. Now, this can be quite subtle. So a manager asking his employees to take part in research is a subtle form of coercion. So is asking your friends to take part in your research. That's a subtle form of coercion. They feel they ought to. And certainly you shouldn't threaten participants for, you take part in my research or I won't take part in yours. So it's all to help prevent harm and abuse, such as feeling deceived, exploited, shamed, or otherwise wronged by the research. So, as I said before, consent is a process. It's not just asking, do you want to take part in my research? Yes or no. In the University of Sheffield, it involves a consent form and an information sheet. Remember, assuming that your research involves participants, human participants, or their personal data. This will tell them what they are agreeing to, what to do if things go wrong, and also what to do if they want to withdraw. Indeed, telling them they can withdraw from the research. In your final dissertation, you might want to talk about the dimensions of consent, from none at all the way to full consent with a consent form and an information sheet, or somewhere in between, partial. An example of that might be you're completing an online survey and you state, by taking part in this online survey you are agreeing to take part in my research and for the results of the research to be used for whatever reason. Consent can be given freely all the way to being coerced and persuaded. Consent can be explicit, you're asked to give it, or implicit. You're doing an observation and you leave a notice in the area you're observing saying that you are conducting research, and if you don't want to be included, please let me know. Some individuals are not able to give consent and they're described as a vulnerable group, and we'll talk about who they are in a moment. Interestingly, children are considered able to give consent, but research involving children is considered high risk. Students are often asked to take part in research, so much so that you could consider them an over-researched group, and it's not ethical to keep on asking the same people over and over again to take part in research. So you need to think about this issue. Typically, participants opt in to your research, but if you're doing observation type research, they may have to opt out. Do you consider your research covert or deceptive? In other words, if the participants knew what you were researching, that would change the outcome. Milgram's experiment, you might be familiar with, was just like this. At the University of Sheffield, this type of research is best avoided. It's considered extremely high risk. And as I said previously, involving your friends in your research is maybe best avoided. It's okay to ask them to check your questionnaire. Maybe you could practice an interview with them, but the data that is produced as a result of using your friends shouldn't be used in your research. It's not fair. They would feel coerced in taking part, and anyway, the answers they give to your questions are related to your relationship with them, and therefore are not as valid as other people who do not know you, typically. You will also need to think about what you do with the data after your research. Typically, you would destroy it and you would tell participants that's what you're going to do. You need to think about if the participants are going to get any compensation, payment, reward or prize for taking part in your research. Within the information school, we discourage this. However, sometimes there is an implicit understanding that if you conduct research, if you ask a participant to take part in your research, they sort of feel obliged to take part in your research, but they don't have to. They're not being coerced into it. The confidentiality of information supplied by research subjects and the anonymity of respondents must be respected. That's true, but there are occasions where you can break confidentiality, but they will be very few and far between. For example, if a participant says something that implies that they are going to hurt themselves or hurt someone else, then it would be okay to break confidentiality. Also, sometimes participants do not want to be anonymous, they want to be named, and you must respect that. Possible issues with confidentiality. When writing about what individuals say, you might want to distinguish between one participant and another. So how do you do that? Typically, you assign a code rather than their name. What if the participant doesn't want to be anonymous? Well, there you would cite their name. but you would need to make it clear in your writing why you're citing this participant's name and not the other participants. We've mentioned when it's okay to break confidentiality, if they're going to hurt themselves, you feel, or hurt someone else. In fact, it might be a legal obligation to do this. Quite often with social media type research, you end up introducing other people into the research because the participant mentions their name, or you see a posting with someone else's name in. What are you going to do about that? Well, typically you cannot include other participants in your research unless they've given their consent, and therefore you'll have to remove this data potentially from your research. Sometimes it's very difficult to maintain confidentiality if it's only a very small sample and it's pretty obvious who these people are. So you need to think about this, and the participants need to know that ultimately they may be able to be identified even though you are not mentioning their name. So for example, if you're researching senior university teachers in the information school, it could only be me. I am the only senior university teacher, even though you don't mention my name. Depending on the research you conduct, each different type of research will introduce different ethical issues. If you're conducting interviews, there's coercion and issues of participant researcher power. Managers have got to be careful interviewing the people that are working for them. If you're doing a survey, online or face-to-face, ensuring anonymity is particularly difficult. Well, it's not difficult, but it's difficult to convince the participant that it would be confidential. If you're doing a pseudo experiment, it can be quite stressful for the participants taking part. Members of staff have asked me to undertake some experiment that they're doing, and I feel I'm being tested because they know me and they know what I've said, so there's an ethical issue there. And as we've mentioned, if you're doing observations, then there are issues there. How do the people give their consent? How do they opt out? What in a crowd of people, one person opts out but all the rest don't? So how do you manage that situation? You might have to abandon all the data you've collected to ensure you adhere to research ethics. Typically you would undertake a literature review. Indeed, your literature review may be a major part of your final dissertation, and this must not distort other people's findings or conclusions just to suit your particular needs, for example quoting out of context. And of course you have to acknowledge other people's ideas, not present them in a way that makes it seem like they're your own. If you're using someone else's data, you may need to obtain their permission and also check that they obtain permission from the participants correctly. You still have a responsibility even though you're not collecting the data. If you're conducting online research, respecting privacy is a particular issue, and them gaining consent can also be. It can considerably slow down your research, but that mustn't stop you doing it in an ethical way. And if you're collecting data in another country, not only must it meet our requirements, but it must reach the ethical standards of the country where the data is being collected. So that makes it doubly difficult. Much social science research refers to the ESRC Research Ethics Framework. This has 5 principles. Firstly, participants must be fully informed about the purpose, methods and intended possible uses of the research, what their participation in the research entails, and what risks, if any, are involved. Clearly, harm to research participants must be avoided. That's not just physical harm, but psychological harm. The confidentiality of information supplied by research participants must be respected. Research participants must participate in a voluntary way, free from coercion or persuasion. The independence of your research must be clear, and any conflicts of interest or partiality must be made explicit. So maybe the last one might not apply to your research, but the other four might. Within the University of Sheffield, our ethics procedure involves deciding whether research has no risk, low risk, or high risk. If you're going to undertake research which is considered high risk, and I'll explain what that involves in a moment, you must begin the process of seeking ethics approval from the university very early in your research. It's a much longer process. For low risk research, all you need to do is fill out an ethics application form and create a participant information sheet and consent form. You submit this and get it approved. For no risk research, you don't need to do anything other than state in your dissertation that there were no risks, no research ethics risks. So what's the difference between high, low and no risk research? Well, high risk research involves particularly vulnerable participants and or focuses on highly sensitive topics. I'll explain what these might be later. Low risk research involves participants in non-sensitive topics, and no risk research involves participants and does not involve participants or sensitive topics. So here's a list of what might be considered vulnerable participants. It includes children, that is, people under the age of 18. However, they can still give consent, but their research involving children is considered high risk. My PhD student has just recently submitted her thesis, and she was researching migrants within a classroom situation. They typically had poor English levels, and therefore her research was considered high risk because they had a basic or elementary knowledge of English. She had to put into place ways of explaining things to people who had a lower level of English, and sometimes this involved other people translating into the native tongue of the people she was interviewing. These are considered sensitive topics, so interviewing people as they leave the exam room would be considered people in a stressful situation and therefore high risk. So this is the end of my recording. I hope you found it useful. If you've got any questions, please come and see me in room RC220, or if you're not able to, there's my email address. Bye bye.